Hi, I'm Tristram Hooley, Professor of Career Education at the University of Derby. I'm going to give a sort of brief version of one of the lectures that I give. Essentially, I've taken out all of the opportunities for anybody else to talk apart from me. So it's an absolute golden opportunity for all of you to hear my voice. So I'm just going to go through and talk about some of the content that we talk about in our lectures. So this one's about career guidance policy and how it works. And in the rest of this course, we look at a lot of different issues which are dealt with in career guidance and which are kind of key policy issues that get governments to think about how they fund career guidance, why they fund career guidance, and so on. So a lot of the course is very issues based. But in this session, I'm going to try and talk a bit about some of the nuts and bolts. So firstly, what does career guidance actually look like? How does policy interact with it in different countries? Particularly, I'm going to talk about the UK and mainly England, in fact, although I will say something about the other UK countries. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about internationally, what some of this stuff looks like internationally, before going on to discuss some of the ways in which policy operates within as an actual activity. So how does policy happen? How does something move from being a government idea or a government document down to being something that a career guidance practitioner is doing in the real world with students, with clients, and so on? So that's what I'm going to try and cover. So hopefully it will be of interest to some of you. So it's basically got three bits: career guidance in the UK, career guidance policy in other countries, and then how does policy work? So let's start with career guidance in the UK. So the first thing to say about the UK is very important is that the UK is actually made up of 4 countries. This is not news to most people, I'm sure, but the career guidance systems that we will find in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are all rather different. In fact, I would say that the Scottish and Welsh system have certain things in common. In England, it's rather different. In Northern Ireland, it's a little bit different again. But that's not the whole story, because although we might look at the national governments, we can also notice that there's a lot of differences at a local level, and particularly in England, where there's been some very big devolution agendas, that if you went somewhere like the Greater Manchester Combined Authority or the West Midlands Combined Authority, you would find a lot of new initiatives and approaches and so on, which would be rather different from the kinds of things that you might see in another area. So career guidance policy is often thought about as a national policy, but in fact is a combination of national policy and local policy. And so we've had lots of different sort of experiences of this as different combinations of responsibilities have been developed between national government and local government. So we'll see a bit more of this as we go through. So as I say, in the devolved nations, we have different systems and, very importantly, different agencies that are critical to the delivery. So in Scotland, we have Skills Development Scotland, which is a national agency which delivers career guidance, but also delivers other kinds of skills policy, so apprenticeships and so on. Some of this is under review at the moment by Scottish Government, but what it means is that Skills Development Scotland really brings together a lot of skills policy, both for young people and for adults in Scotland, and places career guidance really at the centre of it. So it's a very important institution within Scotland. In Careers Wales, we have something similar. Careers Wales, it's not got quite as broad a remit as Skills Development Scotland, but it does again look across the life course. And then we also have a distinct career guidance system within Northern Ireland, of which the Northern Ireland Careers Service is a part. So when we're thinking about UK policy, we need to recognise that each of the countries is different, and there's quite a lot of things that we can look at which give us ideas about that. So what I'm going to do now is go through a series of examples of how career guidance policy is organised in England. Obviously, this is of interest to me. I live in England. I work often in England, although not exclusively. But in a way, many of the issues that we're going to talk through here are equally important. Well, they're all equally important in every country. But I think many of the issues and dilemmas that emerge from this kind of consideration are the same wherever you go. Obviously, the specifics are somewhat different. And the questions that I'm going to look at are, what is the entitlement to career guidance? What can people get? What's the main delivery mechanism? How do you get it? And then which government department is responsible for it? So let's start with young people in schools. So if you're in school, you've got quite a strong entitlement to access career guidance. Young people have there's a statutory duty, that's effectively a law, which says that schools need to provide young people with career guidance. That's then interpreted through the statutory guidance, which essentially, and we could look at this in more detail later perhaps, essentially says young people should be able to access the Gatsby benchmarks. So that's broadly what it says. It says a number of other things as well. So there's quite a good entitlement to career guidance in schools. What's the main delivery mechanism? Well, this is where some of the problems come in. So the main delivery mechanism is schools themselves, which means that all of the things that we want schools to do, schools have to find the time, resource, money, and so on to deliver. And there's been very little of that given to them. So while the entitlement is strong, the delivery mechanism has got a number of issues or a number of weaknesses. And one of the ways that governments try to address that is by funding the Careers and Enterprise Company in England, which is a supportive agency which works with schools in order to deliver some of these things. Again, it's not able to actually deliver lots of services. It supports schools. And so it's reliant on what the schools can actually deliver themselves. And this is all managed by the Department for Education. And if we then move down to young people in colleges, so vocational colleges, what in England we call further education colleges, it's broadly the same as schools. So particularly if we're looking at young people who are 14 to 19, broadly the entitlement to career guidance is the same. The main delivery mechanism in this case is the college. The government department is the Department for Education. If you look at people within colleges who are over 19, there's a little complexity here because people with special needs, it's up to 24, but if you're over 19, then your entitlement is less. So what's the rules for what people who are over 19 in colleges should get? Well, there's not really a lot of regulation or entitlement there. So often colleges will essentially just stretch what they're doing with other students to meet the needs of the adult students that they have. But this is where it starts to get a bit more complicated, because we can see the entitlement is set up for one group. It might then be borrowed and used for other groups. What about if you're NEET? If you're not in education, employment and training, so you're a young person, but you've dropped out of school or college, you're not been able to find a job. What's the situation for you there? Well, there's no real entitlement as such in that case. What there is a requirement for local authorities to pay attention to this group and also try and minimise this group. So what we see is that young people have no real entitlement, but local authorities have a responsibility to try and minimise NEET levels. So anything that happens tends to then be delivered by local authorities. And the government department that deals with this then is the Department for, I think it's called Housing, Communities and Local Authorities. So it's essentially a government department that's responsible for the running of local authorities. And this is where we start to get some problems, I think, because we've got people who, while they're in school, are the kind of problem of the Department for Education. When they come out of school, they're then the problem of someone else. And this creates some challenges for policy. And these kinds of challenges where we fall between the cracks of different ministries are very important in career guidance policy. Okay, if you go to university, you're a higher education student. Once again, there's not a very clear entitlement about exactly what you should have. What there is quite a lot of pressure on universities to deliver good outcomes, to get people jobs and then to deliver them good jobs, essentially. So what's called a graduate outcome. So the main delivery mechanism is the university. They're trying to ensure that their students get good outcomes. That means that they typically invest in higher education careers services. So most universities will have higher education careers services. We'll look at what that includes in a second. So the government department, once again, is the Department for Education here. Right, okay, you've finished university or you've got through college or you found a job. You're now a working person. You're going to probably experience lots of dilemmas in your life as a working person. Many of them will relate to your career, whether you should change job, get more training and so on. Where can you go for help in England? Well, answer, not really anywhere. So there's not a really strong entitlement to career guidance for working adults in England. There's not, therefore, really a main delivery mechanism. And while we might think that the Department for Business and Trade or the Department for Work and Pensions should both have an interest in this, in reality, nobody's very interested in this. So as a working adult, we start to see a really big and important gap in the English career guidance system. Okay, what about if you're unemployed? So if you're not working, then your entitlement to career guidance gets a bit better. So you can probably access the job centre, so what is we would describe as Britain's public employment service, and they will allow you to access some services which are certainly quite like career guidance or adjacent to career guidance, but often delivered by people who don't have any qualifications to do career guidance. If you're lucky and the system works well, you might be referred by one of these people who you meet at the front line of the Public Employment Service. You might be referred to the National Careers Service or to some other kinds of more substantial services that might help you to develop your employability, improve your skills, and so on. The main delivery mechanism, or at least the central agency in this, then becomes the Job Centre Plus, we call it. And the government department is the Department for Work and Pensions, which is essentially England's or Britain's Labour Ministry. Well, it's a sort of a combination between a Labour Ministry and a sort of social protection ministry. Now, what we see is that in current policy, there's a process by which the National Careers Service, which has previously been managed by the Department for Education, is being merged into Job Centre Plus. And so there's going to be a new system, possibly a new organisation with a new brand that's going to emerge out of that. We don't know what it is yet. There's a lot of discussion what that will look like. So, okay, what about some other groups? Well, I've picked just one other group, and we can probably think of quite a lot more that we might want to talk about in the future. But let's focus on one group for now. So this group we can call prisoners, or people who've been involved in the criminal justice system. So it might include ex-prisoners or people who are being managed by the criminal justice system in other ways. And what we can certainly make the argument for is that there's a very strong rationale for working with people who are in the criminal justice system to help them to find learning opportunities and future work. Basically, if people have opportunities, if they have training, if they have work, and they're able to deliver themselves a decent standard of living, it massively reduces the sort of attractiveness of crime. Now, obviously, that depends on different types of crimes and so on, but certainly people being able to find and keep work is very important. So there's a really strong rationale. So where can you get career guidance? Well, there, in fact, is some career guidance provision which you can access both in prisons and to some extent through probation services and wider criminal justice. The main delivery mechanism is very variable and will depend on where you are in the system and how it's currently being delivered. and it may connect to other career guidance services, for example, the National Careers Service, or it may be delivered by the institution that you're part of. The government ministry or department that's interested in this then becomes the Ministry of Justice. And so we've got another ministry that's coming into this. And if we went down and we looked at other groups like people with disabilities or migrants or very many other groups who might benefit from specific career guidance services, we would see that entitlements change and the government department interested changes and so on. So what we can see is that in England, while there are actually many strengths to the career guidance system that we have, there are also a considerable fragmentation in the system. And I think that's a very important thing to think about, because it's one of the problems that is often identified of what is wrong with career guidance in England. So the closest thing we have to a kind of law is we have a statutory duty for career guidance in schools and colleges. I talked about this earlier, and particularly this is interpreted through what's called the statutory guidance. So this is the Career Guidance and Access for Education and Training Providers Guidance is what it's currently called. It's gone through various variations over the years and been called various different things. What's important about this is it sets down both a requirement for schools to deliver career guidance, and it sets out in considerable detail what good practice looks like and therefore what the government expects. So this is a kind of critical document, and what we'll notice is that this kind of thing does not exist anywhere else in the system. So there is no equivalent law that says working people should have access to career guidance, or even unemployed people, so on. So within English schools, then, we have a system which is very strongly framed by policy, and particularly by those statutory instruments that I just talked about. So we have the Gatsby benchmarks that form the basis of what provision should look like. The Gatsby benchmarks and the statutory guidance also encourage people to have a learning outcome-based approach to their career guidance provision, their careers education provision within schools. And so we have a document produced by the professional association, the Career Development Institute, and they have a framework of learning outcomes and so on. We also notice that there's the careers profession, so careers leaders and careers advisors who work within the school system, and there is some regulation about how those people should be trained, what level they should be qualified to, and so on. And then there's the support that I talked about already from the Careers and Enterprise Company and the Careers Hubs, which provide support for this whole system to operate. And so we have a system here, and when we look at this system, what we see is that some of it is required by policy, other bits are optional, other bits have been pushed in by sector bodies who have ideas about how this should work best, and so on. It's not as simple as the government decides how it works, and that is how it works. In higher education, the system is rather different. There's much less involvement from government in many ways. Much of it is driven by a market-based system, which argues that students in higher education should receive good outcomes, which is usually understood to be an employment as an outcome, and also good or graduate employment. And then that is interpreted through statistics into a series of league tables which exercise universities considerably. So while there's relatively little guidance on what career guidance within higher education should look like, there's a strong driver which does come from government and from a wider higher education market, which encourages universities to engage with this. But having said that, we could look over the last sort of 20 to 30, or 30 to 40 even years here, and notice that while universities have a degree of autonomy from government, and consequently they have the freedom to organise careers services how they choose, there's often a lot of policy that's influenced this, and it's often influenced it quite unwittingly. So I won't go through all of these different laws and initiatives and reports and inquiries and so on that have been created by government over the last 40 years. But suffice to say, some of them are specifically focused on career guidance services in some way, but most are much, much broader and are not focused on that. So that then becomes a sense that wider changes to the system result in changes to career guidance policy or to career guidance provision. And this, I think, is another important message from when we think about career guidance policy, is that career guidance policy is not only documents or initiatives that specifically mention career guidance, but also other things which relate to that in some way. If we look at what careers services in higher education look like, we can see that they're often pretty sophisticated. They have a lot of different services organized under, and I've organized them here under some headings. This is in a forthcoming paper that me and Karen Coney have written. And what we argue in this is that we get a set of services that HE Careers Services provide, which are about students, about supporting students, helping them to figure out their career, talk to them, give them information, so on. There's a set of interventions that careers services will do with curriculum, so working with academics to deliver teaching and learning, which addresses employability and careers outcomes. There's also a similar set of activities that these services might do to work with employers. And then finally, career services in higher education are often institutionally quite important and related to a lot of significant areas of institutional strategy. So many, particularly senior people in these services, will get involved in lots of this kind of activity. So that might be writing teaching and learning strategies, or writing employer engagement strategies for the institution and that kind of thing, or feeding into them at least. So what we see is that while schools have a lot of policy which directs how schools should organise their provision, higher education doesn't, but it has sufficient policy drivers to mean that universities are generally investing quite substantially in career services. If we look at the adult sector, I've already talked about the job centre, which is where you go if you're unemployed, essentially. It's a service which, as well as providing some employment support and advice, also helps you to manage your benefits, receive benefits, and so on. But they will often be referring to the National Careers Service, which sounds like a service which all adults could access, or indeed all people. But in fact tends to, or historically has been much more targeted on those who are furthest from the labour market. So people who are unemployed or who are barriered in some other way, they can access career guidance, usually from qualified professionals within the National Careers Service. And there's a very strong relationship between the National Careers Service and the Job Centre, although they have been in different ministries for quite a long while. As I said earlier, these are now being brought together, so we will be seeing a new type of service being delivered probably from next year. So all of this gets us into politics, and I don't want to talk a lot about the ins and outs of different political sort of developments that we've seen over recent years. What we can see here, and we've got three key ministers from the Labour government on the side here. Labour promised a number of relatively modest but important changes to the career guidance system. But these promises, mainly ones around work experience and around the training of careers advisors, have been reneged on. They're not going to really happen. We've also seen, and this is not really anything to do with career guidance, but we've seen a wider funding crisis in higher education and post-16 education more generally, so in further education colleges. And this obviously creates potentially a dangerous climate for career guidance services, because if universities and colleges have less money, they might spend less on career guidance than they do. There's proposals in the post-16 education and skills white paper, but but I would feel that they're not sufficient to make significant differences here. And then I've already talked about the merger of the National Careers Service and the Job Centre Plus. That's another big area in which the Labour Party is currently thinking about career guidance. So again, we see a mix of specific policies that address career guidance directly and wider policies that have implications for career guidance. So when we're thinking about policy within career guidance, we need to recognise both of those processes. So what's wrong with this system? I think it's a good area of consideration for everybody to think about what would they like to see to improve how career guidance operates. And there's an organisation which is called the Career Development Policy Group, which is essentially a kind of sector-led lobbying group which tries to campaign for better career guidance services. They've developed what they call the Career Guidance Guarantee, and it has a number of elements that are worth just briefly mentioning as kind of ideas about where there might be some issues and problems in the existing English system. So the first would be, they argue that we should publish a careers strategy, so that there should be some kind of structures for coordination and cooperation that sit around this very fragmented landscape that I've talked you through. Secondly, the Gatsby revolution, so the work that happens in schools and colleges, should be finished. We should get to the point where all schools are able to deliver the Gatsby benchmarks, and that probably means the injection of some money or some stronger regulation. Thirdly, that there's insufficient structures and support and resourcing to support young people who are not in education, and that needs to be addressed and put in place. Similarly, that there needs to be more done to support universities, and particularly for people once they leave universities. In general, the thinking in the Career Guidance Guarantee is that lifelong provision is insufficient, and particularly insufficient for working people. And finally, that all of these initiatives should be underpinned by high quality services, quality assurance, and then professionalism and professionalisation. And generally the assumption is that the sector is insufficiently professionalised. Okay, secondly, let's just briefly look at how some of this works in other countries and draw on some international work as well. So I wrote a paper quite a few years ago now where I looked at public policy in different countries, and I sort of created this spectrum that I think hopefully is still useful. And at one end, you've got countries that really have very little public provision for career guidance. And at the other end, we've got the kind of ideal of the lifelong guidance system. And that's a system where pretty much everyone can get what they need and get help with their career throughout their life. Now, that lifelong guidance system, I would say, doesn't exist in a perfect form in any country, but there are certainly countries that get a bit closer to it than England. I think if we go back, there are other countries where you might find good provision in schools, or at least some provision in schools, but very little for adults. Or the other way around, you might find a public employment service that works pretty well, but very little attention on these issues within schools or education. Where I think we are in England, and probably where an awful lot of kind of global north type countries are, is what I would call non-systemic lifelong provision. So we have some provision for most, if not all, groups in society to access career guidance, but it's not available equally. It's not available for everyone, and most importantly, it doesn't all connect up. So you can do one thing in the school system, then you go to university, you do something completely different. It doesn't link to what you've learned in the career learning that you've done in school, and so on. And so this is why the idea of having a career strategy is something that's appealing, I think. So where does lifelong guidance provision actually happen? Well, I've sort of talked through this in the context of England, but it's worth just sort of revisiting this. I think there's a lot of guidance provision that happens in the education system. I would say that's the most important location in terms of where provision is actually located internationally, in schools, in vocational education, in higher education, to some extent in adult education. It also happens in the employment system, so in the public employment service, perhaps in services for working peoples, perhaps within employers, perhaps within trade unions, in outplacement, which is sort of services that are made available to people at the point at which they're engaged in a career transition or being made redundant, and also an important private sector in career guidance, which exists in many countries, although I would argue it's not a substantial part of the system in any country. Finally, there might be sort of social welfare services, so services for disadvantaged groups, perhaps people with disabilities or migrants or people who are in the criminal justice system, and probably other groups as well. So in many countries, we see, as we've seen in England, the location for career guidance services being quite dispersed. Now, international work has looked at how career guidance is organised within the school system, and it basically argues there are three sort of approaches. So at one end, we have the sort of guidance counsellor model, and that's usually where there's an individual or small team within the school who is responsible not only for career guidance, but also for other areas such as pastoral care of the young people in the school. So that might be dealing with things like bereavement, it might be dealing with teen pregnancies, it might be dealing with kids who get involved with substance abuse, and so on and so on. Within that, career guidance and helping people to choose their next step and so on is an important part of it. But often there's some tensions between the kind of acute issues, which are often related to people's problems, and the sort of slightly more longer term issues which relate to people's careers. On the other end of the models, we could have an external model where an external agency, essentially or most normally the Public Employment Service, works into the school to deliver services. And the school doesn't necessarily have an awful lot to do with that external organisation. They will create spaces for it to come in. They might send students out to it. They might refer to it, but they're not really working as in partnership with it. So that gives us the third model, which the OECD certainly argued was the strongest model. I think there's arguments to have about where we put the emphasis in different things, but the partnership model sort of combines these two. So we have responsibility in the school, but we also have responsibility from an external agency. The focus then becomes on collaboration and cooperation between the external agency and the internal agency, with both having responsibility to deliver careers, education and guidance. So Scotland or Wales that I've talked about would be good examples of this kind of approach. And more broadly, we've seen, I've talked about the Gatsby benchmarks. I'm not going to go into the Gatsby benchmarks in great detail here, but what the international research that led to this gives us is a sense of the kinds of things that constitute good practice within schools. So stability, learning from labour market information, embedding things in the curriculum, and so on. Lots of different elements that we might constitute as good career guidance within schools. And that's been influential. The Gatsby benchmarks is an influential framework in England. It's been influential in a number of other countries as well. But I think if we think of it not as a model to deliver, but as a way of thinking about what makes effective career guidance internationally, it's a reasonably good summary of the evidence base. And I've also pulled out here from the latest report from Gatsby, the enablers, so the things that support this to work effectively in schools. So that includes sort of frameworks being enshrined in policy, investment and resources, the provision of labour market information, and so on. Coordination and brokerage of relationships with employers, and all of these sorts of things. So um, we have a sense of how career guidance works effectively in schools. That is quite well understood. Practice has been shared around between many different countries to get us to this kind of thinking. I also did some work fairly recently with the Gatsby Foundation to look at try and do something similar for adults and say, well, if we look at experiences in other countries, what would we count as being effective adult guidance services? And we get again a similar set of thoughts about what constitutes effective adult guidance. We get stuff around vision, we get stuff around collaboration and cooperation, the importance of professionalization, the balance between local and national delivery, clearly understood and accessible services, and access to good labour market data. And as you see, the more work you look at that looks at policy systems for the delivery of career guidance, the more these issues come through time and time again, whatever bit of the system we look at. So we could look at all sorts of different systems across different countries. There's most countries in the world, certainly a very large number of countries, have some kind of career guidance system. It varies in scope and nature. What I'm going to do is focus in on one now, which is Norway. And I focus in on Norway not because it's perfect, although I think it has a number of very big strengths, but I think it also has a number of the issues that we've already explored in relation to the English system. So Norway has a school system which is kind of a guidance counselor type system. They also have a subject which you do when you're about 15, which is called education and work, which is a sort of timetabled subject to help young people make decisions about upper secondary and work, post education work choices. In higher education, they have like relatively limited services if you compared them to England, I would say. Most universities will have a careers service. It typically is rather smaller than the sorts of things that you would find in England. They don't have this level of pressure on student outcomes. It's not so there's not as much focus within higher education on it. Then within the public employment service, which is called NAV, we have services for unemployed and barriered people. These, I think, is a relatively high quality service. In some ways, it has similarities to the Job Centre Plus, but I think generally you would be able to access more services within the system. So you might be able to access career guidance, but also psychologists and other forms of support. And again, be referred out to longer term programs and training and things like that. There's also careers centres in each county, which are available for any citizens to access and to find out, talk to someone about their career. So it's a kind of local universal service, covers working people. We would also see migrant services that would be available to people as part of the process of integrating migrants into Norway and into the labour market. Again, career guidance could be part of that. And then there is a private sector, as there is in most countries, although it's relatively small. So what we can see is that there are both similarities and differences with England. They're not all, it's not that one is necessarily better than the other, but Norway certainly has some strengths. One of the things that I think gives it strength is that it's a relatively new system. It's been developed really over the last 20 or so years, and it's had very strong and consistent policy leadership. And there's been the development of a comprehensive quality framework which underpins all of these things and tries to pull them together. It's not immune from the issue of fragmentation, but there is, I think, more attention to the kind of creating coherence. Okay, so we've thought about career guidance in England, we've thought about career guidance in other countries. Let's think a little bit about how policy works before we finish. So firstly, we have ways in which policy is done? So how do we get people to do things? So if we think a politician passes a law, thinks about something that they want to achieve, how do we make sure that happens? Well, we've basically got three main sort of tools that we might use. So carrots, economic incentives, other forms of things, training, support, these kinds of things that might help an institution to develop and implement career guidance. Second is sticks. Regulations, laws, rules, penalties, punishments, these kinds of things, inspections, all sorts of things that mean if you don't do what you're supposed to do, then you get in trouble in some way. And those two things I think are the most important. But government also has another tool which we might call sermons. So we mean the kind of what a sermon is the kind of speech that the priest gives you on Sunday about how you should live your life. And government loves sermons. So government loves to tell people how to do things when it doesn't necessarily want to get involved in the process of either giving money or setting up a regulatory framework. So we might get speeches from politicians, we might get information being passed on, we might even get suggested curricula or models of good practice. This would all fall into the sermons territory, and it's a way in which we can move things forwards without necessarily kind of changing the law or finding large amounts of funding or engaging in restructuring things. And if we put these three together and in different combinations, we would find most of the ways in which we make policy happen. So political scientists will tell you that the way policies work is through something like this. This is a policy cycle or a version of a policy cycle. And so a policy cycle would probably start with the identification of a problem or an objective. There's something government wants to do. So it might be we want to get more people to choose science, technology, engineering and maths courses. And we think career guidance could be part of that. So we then get some time where the government forms its policy, develops it. If it's doing it well, it might consult with people. It might get advice on it. It might kind of bring in an expert to talk about it and so on. But once they've got it, they'll write it down, put it into some form, decide on how they're going to do it, and then we move into the policy implementation phase. And that's where we get carrots, sticks, and sermons being used. And after it's been running for a while, again, if a government's doing this well, then they will probably want to evaluate that policy and think about how that policy has worked. And once they've got the findings of the evaluation, well, there's probably some things that haven't gone as well as you hoped, or there might be potential, and perhaps there's some things that are going brilliantly well. You might want to support much further. And then we move into a redevelopment or policy development again, where we start to think, okay, well, we've done this, perhaps we can improve it, perhaps we can develop it, and so on. Now, the problem with this sort of cycle, which is very logical and really would make sense and would be great if politicians did it, is that in my kind of almost 20 years of being involved in some kind of policy development within career guidance, I don't think I've ever seen this really work out quite in this way. Because what often happens in reality is a policy is invented, it's implemented relatively quickly with insufficient consultation. It's perhaps not fully thought through about how the implementation is going to go. And then by the time it's just about getting figured out and working, we might see that minister move into another job, or the government change, or the focus of the government change, or a financial crisis happen, or whatever. And even if they get as far as doing an evaluation, it's asking for government to think quite long term for this sort of stuff to actually happen. So the policy cycle is a nice ideal, but in practice it often doesn't work. So I then, in thinking about this, I published an article with Lorraine Goodin where we looked at some of this, and we said, actually, it's not helpful to think about it as a series of a kind of perfect cycle. It's much more useful to think about it in this way. So first thing is policies are done by people. They don't emerge out of the air. And those people are not all politicians. There are actually lots of different people involved in it. There are experts, there are practitioners, there are unions, there are professional associations, there are employers. There's all sorts of people involved in it. And some of them love the policy, some of them hate it, some of them want to influence it, some of them want to stop it altogether. There's all sorts of different possibilities. Lots of people involved. Actors, we call them. Second thing is processes. There are lots of ways in which policies are written. They're written down, they're communicated in different ways, but then they're also shared with the world in different ways. That might include political debates, it might include media articles, it might include training courses, all sorts of things. So the process of development and implementation of a policy is not a single thing, but it is many things. And then we recognize that this all takes place within an environment. So when a government changes its opinion about something, it may be because the wider politics have changed. It may be because there's been a financial crash and there's no longer so much money around. It may be for all sorts of reasons. It might be because there's been wider reforms in the education system that shift how career guidance policy is operating. All sorts of things. So when we think about it, what happens, and this article I wrote was called How the Sausage Gets Made, and it comes from a saying that is attributed to Bismarck, although actually I think it isn't Bismarck who said it originally, which says, laws are like sausages, it's better not to see how they get made. And in this case, what we were trying to focus on is how does policy or the sausages actually get made. And what we found was that we can think about it in sort of three levels. So at the top, we've got the government, the policy framing tier. That's where we normally get most of the attention when we're thinking about policies. And then so governments might develop a policy, they then pass it down to a middle tier. So that's people like trainers, that might be advisors, that might be local governments, it might be unions, it might be all sorts of people who are responsible for interpreting it, sharing it, getting people to engage with it. And then at the street level, we've got the career guidance practitioners, we've got the teachers, we've got the people who work in the public employment service. What's important to spot here is that there isn't very often very direct communication between government and the person on the front line. And so what we see is the process of implementing a policy is a process of passing it down through a series of stakeholders who all have the opportunity to reshape it, tweak it, rethink it, and so on. And once we get to the street level, the career guidance practitioner who's got this new policy they're supposed to be implementing, they also have a choice to make a decision about how much of this do I want to do, how much of it might I be able to get away with not doing, and so on. Lipsky called this street level policy making. And he said, look, there's actually a lot of possibility for somebody at the ground level to act almost as if they're a policymaker. So to actually shape the policy. So what we argue in this article is that we see government involved in a process of trying to push down policy into systems. And as it pushes down, it gets reshaped and reformed and reworked and turns into something slightly different. Equally, we see everyone in the system pushing up to try and reshape policy, improve it, change it, make it more in their interests, and so on. So policy is not really this logical policy cycle that we just talked through. Rather, it's a process of negotiation, discussion, power. Ultimately, it's a process of politics. It's a process by which different actors in society influence how much something happens. So what I've tried to say in this lecture is to explain something of how policy works. So I've gone through, talked about a number of quite concrete examples of how do things work in England and in various other countries. And then we finished by trying to think, well, how does policy actually happen? And recognizing that it's happening is not inevitable. It's a process of politics. It's a dynamic process by which things change and develop. So if you're interested in this, there's a lot of literature which discusses this. Everything I've talked about today, I've tried to pick up here in the references. So we've got some references, we've got some more references there. So I hope some of that's been interesting. I hope it's given you a sense of why, firstly, I think policy is really important, central to effective career guidance practice. But secondly, of why I think it's really interesting, because it's complicated and it's difficult and it involves lots of negotiation. So when you hear someone talk about policy, we're not just talking about some dry document that's produced by a government. We're thinking about the process by which ideas become systems, become reality, and affect the change for the clients and students that we're working with. Thank you.